The notification sound from my phone pierced through the silence of my empty apartment at 2:47 a.m. I reached for it groggily, expecting another spam email or late-night social media alert. Instead, my blood turned ice cold as I stared at the screen. It was a tagged photo on Instagram from the TechCrunch Disrupt conference in San Francisco. There, beaming at the camera with her arms wrapped around my boyfriend Jake and holding a gleaming trophy, was my best friend since college, Melissa Chen. The caption made my stomach drop even further. Congratulations to Melissa Chen and Jake Rodriguez for winning the Best Startup Award for their revolutionary fitness app, FitSync. This power couple is definitely going places. FitSync, the name I had scribbled in my notebook during countless late-night brainstorming sessions. The concept I had spent 18 months developing, researching, and perfecting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The business plan I had shared with Melissa over wine and takeout in this very apartment just 6 months ago, trusting her completely as I outlined every detail of my vision. I scrolled through the comments, each one feeling like a knife twist. Investors were already reaching out. Tech bloggers were calling it the next big thing in wellness technology. The app I had dreamed of creating was being celebrated across the internet, but my name was nowhere to be found. My hands trembling, I clicked through to Melissa's profile. Photo after photo showed her and Jake together at the conference, networking, with investors, giving interviews to tech journalists. In one video, she was explaining her innovative approach to combining AI-powered fitness coaching with social accountability features. Every word that came out of her mouth was something I had said to her during our planning sessions. The betrayal was complete and devastating. Not only had my supposed best friend stolen my business idea and claimed it as her own, but she had also apparently stolen my boyfriend of 3 years in the process. Jake, who had been acting distant and too busy with work to see me for the past month, was now being celebrated as Melissa's business partner and romantic partner. I set the phone down and stared at the ceiling of my studio apartment in Austin, Texas, where I had been bootstrapping my startup dreams while working as a freelance marketing consultant. The contrast between my modest life and the glamorous success Melissa was now enjoying with my stolen idea was almost too much to bear. My name is Sarah Martinez, and up until that devastating moment, I thought I had my life figured out. At 28, I was finally ready to take the leap from freelance marketing work to launching my own tech startup. I had spent years building my expertise in digital marketing while secretly developing what I believed would be a game-changing fitness application. The idea for FitSync had come to me during my own fitness journey. After struggling with inconsistent workout routines and lack of motivation, I realized that the missing piece in most fitness apps was genuine social accountability combined with personalized AI coaching, not the fake social features that most apps offered, but real connections with workout partners who shared similar goals and schedules. I had spent countless hours researching the market, developing user personas, creating wireframes, and building a comprehensive business plan. My background in marketing gave me insights into user acquisition strategies that most technical founders overlooked. I knew exactly how to position the app, which demographics to target first, and how to build a community that would drive organic growth. But launching a tech startup requires more than just a great idea and marketing expertise. It requires capital, technical development skills, and connections in the startup ecosystem. That's where I had been struggling. My freelance income barely covered my living expenses in Austin, leaving little room for the kind of investment needed to build and launch an app. Jake Rodriguez had been my boyfriend since we met at a digital marketing conference 3 years earlier. At 31, he was a senior software engineer at an established tech company in Austin, with exactly the technical skills needed to build my vision. We had talked extensively about him joining me as a co-founder once I was ready to make the leap. Jake was methodical and analytical, the perfect complement to my creative and strategic thinking. He had been enthusiastic about FitSync during our early discussions, offering technical insights and helping me refine the feasibility of various features. I had trusted him completely with every aspect of the business plan, assuming he would be my co-founder when the time came to launch. Melissa Chen had been my closest friend since our sophomore year at the University of Texas, where we both studied business. She was brilliant, ambitious, and came from a wealthy family in California who had connections throughout Silicon Valley. While I had chosen the scrappy freelance path after graduation, Melissa had moved to San Francisco and quickly climbed the ranks at a prestigious venture capital firm. Melissa was everything I wasn't in the business world. Where I was passionate and creative, she was polished and politically savvy. Where I struggled to network and make connections, she effortlessly moved through Silicon Valley's social circles. She had access to investors, mentors, and opportunities that I could only dream of from my small apartment in Austin. Our friendship had been built on mutual support and shared ambitions. During college, we had spent countless nights discussing our dreams of building successful businesses and changing the world through technology. Melissa had always been encouraging about my ideas, offering advice and connections when she could. 6 months ago, when I finally felt ready to move forward, with FitSync, I had flown to San Francisco to spend a long weekend with Melissa. Over expensive dinners and wine tastings in Napa Valley, I had shared every detail of my business plan. I walked her through the market research, showed her my user personas, explained my monetization strategy, and outlined my technical requirements. Melissa had been incredibly engaged, asking insightful questions and offering suggestions based on her experience in the venture capital world. She helped me refine my pitch deck and connected me with a few potential advisors. I had left that weekend feeling more confident than ever about my path forward. What I didn't realize was that I had just handed over everything needed to steal my entire business concept. The weeks following that weekend, both Melissa and Jake had become increasingly busy and distant. Melissa claimed she was working on a major deal that required all her attention. Jake said his company was going through a reorganization that demanded longer hours. I had been understanding, even supportive, believing that their temporary absence would give me time to focus on preparing for my startup launch. I had used those weeks to finalize my business plan, research potential team members, and save every penny I could toward development costs. I had been planning to formally pitch Jake on joining as CTO and reach out to Melissa about potential investor introductions. Instead, they had apparently been working together to bring my vision to life. Without me. Now, staring at the photos of their success, I began to piece together the timeline of their betrayal. The conference where they were celebrating had taken place over the past 3 days. That meant they had been developing FitSync for months, probably since shortly after my visit to San Francisco. I opened my laptop and began researching everything I could find about their version of FitSync. The app description matched my business plan almost word for word. The target demographics were identical to my research. Even the pricing strategy was exactly what I had outlined to Melissa during our weekend together. But it was worse than simple idea theft. As I dug deeper into the available information, I realized they had also implemented my specific marketing strategies. The launch campaign they were running used the exact messaging framework I had developed. They were targeting the precise customer segments I had identified through months of research. They hadn't just stolen my idea. They had stolen my entire go-to-market strategy. The most painful part was seeing how effortlessly they had executed what I had been struggling to make happen. Melissa's connections had secured them meetings with top-tier investors within weeks. Jake's technical skills and his company's resources had allowed them to build and launch the app in a fraction of the time it would have taken me to bootstrap. They had taken my vision and used their combined advantages to bring it to market, while I was still trying to figure out how to fund development. I spent the rest of the night combing through every piece of information I could find about their startup. They had incorporated as FitSync Technologies 3 months ago. The team listed on their website included Jake as CTO and Melissa as CEO, along with 2 other engineers I didn't recognize. Their funding announcement, buried in a TechCrunch article from 2 weeks earlier, revealed they had raised $2 million in seed funding from Pinnacle Ventures, the very firm where Melissa worked. The article quoted Melissa extensively about her innovative approach to solving fitness motivation challenges through community-driven accountability. Every quote attributed to her contained ideas and insights I had shared during our conversations. As dawn broke over Austin, I finally closed my laptop and tried to process the magnitude of what had happened. Not only had I lost my boyfriend and my best friend, but I had also lost what I believed was my path to financial independence and professional fulfillment. The rational part of my mind told me to accept the loss and move on. Ideas couldn't be copyrighted, and I had no legal recourse for concept theft. Melissa and Jake had executed better than I could have, using advantages I didn't possess. In the brutal world of startup competition, perhaps this was simply how things worked. But the rational part of my mind was quickly being overwhelmed by something much more powerful, a burning determination to seek justice for what they had done to me. I had spent years building trust with both of them, sharing not just my business ideas, but my deepest hopes and fears. I had been vulnerable with them in ways I rarely allowed myself to be with anyone. Their betrayal wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. As I sat in my small apartment, surrounded by the notebooks and whiteboards where I had developed the concept they had stolen, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. I had advantages they didn't know about. My marketing background had taught me how to research people and companies in ways that went far beyond surface-level searches. I knew how to track digital footprints, analyze patterns, and uncover information that others might miss. More importantly, I knew both of them better than they realized. I knew Melissa's insecurities behind her polished facade. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I knew Jake's tendency to cut corners when he thought no one was watching. I knew their weaknesses, their blind spots, and their patterns of behavior. They had underestimated me, assuming I would simply accept their betrayal and move on with my life. That assumption was about to become their biggest mistake. I opened a new notebook and began writing. At the top of the first page, I wrote Project Payback in bold letters. Below that, I began outlining everything I knew about FitSync Technologies, their funding, their team, and their go-to-market strategy. If Melissa and Jake thought they could steal my life's work and live happily ever after, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The game was just beginning, and I intended to win. The first thing I learned about seeking justice is that emotions make terrible strategists. After 3 days of crying, rage-eating ice cream, and drafting angry texts I never sent, I realized that my fury wasn't going to accomplish anything productive. If I wanted to expose what Melissa and Jake had done to me, I needed to approach this like the marketing professional I was, with research, planning, and cold calculation. I started by creating what I called my evidence portfolio. Every screenshot, every saved conversation, every document that proved my ownership of the FitSync concept went into carefully organized digital folders. I had timestamps on my original sketches, dated entries in my business journal, and saved email drafts where I'd outlined features to potential advisors months before Melissa and Jake's launch. The challenge was that ideas themselves aren't legally protected. I couldn't simply march into court with my notebooks and demand they stop using my concept. But what I could potentially prove was a pattern of deception, breach of trust, and possibly even fraud, if I could demonstrate they had deliberately misled investors about the origins of their business. My background in digital marketing had taught me to think like a detective when researching competitors and market opportunities. Now, I turned those same skills toward investigating the people who had betrayed me. I began with Jake, since I knew his patterns and weaknesses better than anyone. Jake had always been meticulous about documenting his work, a habit that stemmed from his engineering background and perfectionist tendencies. He maintained detailed commit logs in his personal GitHub repositories, kept comprehensive notes in various productivity apps, and had a tendency to overshare his professional activities on LinkedIn. Digging through his recent posts, I found something interesting. 3 months ago, around the time they would have started developing FitSync, Jake had posted about exciting new challenges and working on innovative fitness technology solutions. But what caught my attention was a comment thread where he discussed specific technical approaches to AI-powered coaching algorithms. The approaches he described were identical to solutions we had brainstormed together during our conversations. About FitSync's technical requirements, these weren't generic industry concepts. They were specific implementations I had suggested based on my research into user behavior patterns and motivational psychology. I screenshot every post, comment, and interaction, building a timeline that showed Jake discussing his ideas shortly after our private conversations about them. It wasn't smoking gun evidence, but it was a start. Melissa proved more challenging to investigate. Her social media presence was carefully curated and professional, offering little insight into her actual activities or thought processes. However, her professional network was extensive and public, and I realized I could learn a lot by studying her connections and interactions. I created fake LinkedIn and Twitter accounts using variations of common names, complete with believable but generic profiles. Through these accounts, I began following industry discussions, startup announcements, and investor communications in Melissa's networks. I wasn't trying to interact or gather private information. I was simply observing public conversations and tracking patterns. What I discovered was fascinating and disturbing. Melissa had been much more active in fitness technology discussions than her public profile suggested. In private group forums for venture capital professionals, she had posted extensively about market opportunities in the wellness space, the insights she shared, the market gaps she identified, and the solution frameworks she proposed all aligned perfectly with research I had conducted and shared with her. More damning was a post from 4 months ago where she had asked for introductions to technical co-founders interested in fitness technology ventures. The specifications she listed for her ideal partner matched Jake's skills and experience almost exactly. It appeared she had been planning to recruit a technical co-founder even before they announced their relationship. The timeline was becoming clearer. Melissa hadn't spontaneously fallen in love with Jake or suddenly discovered a passion for fitness technology. She had strategically identified him as the technical talent needed to execute the business plan I had given her, and she had pursued both the business opportunity and the romantic relationship with calculated precision. But I needed more than circumstantial evidence and suspicious timing. I needed proof of their deliberate deception or documentation of them acknowledging my original ownership of the concept. This is where my knowledge of both their personalities became crucial. Jake was naturally honest and had a tendency to over-explain himself when he felt guilty about something. Melissa, meanwhile, was supremely confident, but had a weakness for showing off her strategic thinking to people she considered intellectual equals. I decided to reach out to them directly, but not in the way they would expect. My plan required careful timing and psychological manipulation. I waited until they returned from the San Francisco conference, when they would be riding high on their success, but potentially vulnerable to questions about their rapid rise. I crafted my approach to appeal to their egos while creating opportunities for them to reveal information they shouldn't share. I started with Jake, sending him a congratulatory text that was warm but not accusatory. I told him I had seen the news about FitSync and was excited about his success. I mentioned that I was still working on my own fitness technology ideas and would love to hear about his experience navigating the startup world. His response came within an hour, and it was exactly what I had hoped for. Jake had always been eager to share his professional achievements, and his guilt about our relationship made him overcompensate with friendliness. He suggested we meet for coffee to catch up, saying he would love to share insights from the startup journey. The coffee meeting took place at a neutral location in downtown Austin, a busy cafe where our conversation would seem casual, but where I could record audio on my phone without suspicion. I arrived early and chose a corner table that would minimize background noise while keeping our voices clear. Jake appeared nervous when he arrived, which told me everything I needed to know about his guilty conscience. He was overly cheerful, complimenting my appearance and asking detailed questions about my freelance work, as if he genuinely cared about my professional success. The performance was almost convincing, but I knew him too well to be fooled. I let him talk about FitSync for nearly 30 minutes before asking my first pointed question. I mentioned that his AI coaching approach sounded similar to concepts we had discussed during our relationship, and I wondered if our conversations had influenced his thinking. His response was a masterclass in accidental confession. Jake immediately became defensive, explaining in excessive detail how his approach was completely different from anything we had talked about. But in his eagerness to differentiate his work from our conversations, he ended up describing technical solutions that were identical to ones I had outlined to him months earlier. More importantly, he revealed details about the development timeline that contradicted their public story. According to interviews Melissa had given, they had spent nearly a year developing FitSync. But Jake's nervous explanations revealed they had actually built the core app in just 3 months, using frameworks and approaches that would have been impossible without the extensive planning and research I had already completed. When I asked about his partnership with Melissa, Jake's discomfort became even more obvious. He claimed their romantic relationship had developed naturally as they worked together, but his body language and verbal hesitations suggested a different story. He mentioned that Melissa had really understood the vision from the beginning and had been incredibly insightful about market positioning. These weren't things someone would typically say about a romantic partner's business acumen, unless that business acumen had been the foundation of their relationship. By the end of our conversation, I had recorded Jake inadvertently admitting that their development timeline was much shorter than publicly claimed, that their technical approach matched solutions we had discussed privately, and that Melissa's business insights had been crucial to their success. None of these admissions were explicit confessions, but they created a pattern that contradicted their public narrative. My approach with Melissa required a different strategy. She was too sophisticated to be caught off guard by direct questions, and she had always been better at controlling her responses than Jake. Instead, I decided to appeal to her ego and her desire to be seen as a strategic mastermind. I reached out through a mutual acquaintance from college, someone who worked in the Austin startup scene and had genuine reasons to be interested in Melissa's success. Through this intermediary, I arranged to have Melissa invited to speak at a small industry event about rapid startup scaling strategies. The event was real, organized by a local entrepreneur group, but I had quietly suggested Melissa as a speaker through my marketing contacts in the community. She agreed to participate, probably seeing it as an opportunity to build her profile and potentially identify new investment opportunities. I attended the event not as Sarah Martinez, her former best friend, but as a marketing consultant interested in startup growth strategies. I had styled my appearance differently, wearing professional attire that was more conservative than my usual look, and I positioned myself in the middle of the audience where I wouldn't immediately catch her attention. Melissa's presentation was polished and confident, exactly what I had expected. She discussed the importance of market timing, technical execution, and strategic partnerships in startup success. But what interested me most were the questions she answered during the Q&A session. When someone asked about her process for identifying market opportunities, Melissa's response included specific research methodologies and user analysis techniques that I had developed and shared with her. She presented them as her own insights, discussing the frameworks she had created for understanding customer motivation in the fitness space. Another question about building technical teams prompted her to describe her approach to recruiting co-founders. Her criteria for evaluating technical talent and her methods for assessing cultural fit matched conversations we had had about what to look for in a CTO. She was essentially plagiarizing not just my business concepts, but my hiring, philosophy, and strategic thinking. The most revealing moment came when someone asked about overcoming the challenge of being a non-technical founder in a technology-driven space. Melissa's response included detailed explanations of technical concepts and development approaches that demonstrated knowledge far beyond what a business-focused founder would typically possess. She was describing technical solutions in language that suggested intimate familiarity with the development process, but she was presenting herself as someone who had learned these concepts through her partnership with Jake. The level of detail in her explanations suggested she had access to comprehensive technical documentation and planning materials that went far beyond what a CEO would normally review. After the event, I lingered near the networking area, listening to Melissa's conversations with other attendees. In casual discussions, she revealed even more information about their development process, funding strategy, and market approach. Every insight she shared as her own thinking aligned with research and planning I had conducted months earlier. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. During a conversation with a potential investor, Melissa mentioned that she had been working on fitness technology concepts for over a year before meeting Jake. She described how she had identified the market opportunity and developed the core business model before finding the right technical partner to execute her vision. This directly contradicted the romantic narrative they had been promoting, where their business partnership had grown out of their personal relationship. Instead, it suggested that Melissa had been planning a fitness technology startup long before she and Jake announced their romantic involvement. More importantly, the timeline she described aligned perfectly with our weekend in San Francisco, where I had shared my complete business plan with her. She was essentially admitting to a room full of potential investors that she had been developing fitness technology concepts since around the time of our conversations. I recorded portions of the networking conversations using my phone's voice memo app, capturing her descriptions of her strategic thinking and development timeline. Combined with Jake's inadvertent admissions and the digital evidence I had gathered, I was building a comprehensive case that demonstrated their deception. But evidence was only part of my strategy. I also needed to understand their vulnerabilities and identify pressure points that could be used to expose their fraud. This required a deeper investigation into their business operations, funding relationships, and future plans. I began researching Pinnacle Ventures, the firm where Melissa worked, and which had led their seed funding round. Venture capital firms have strict policies about conflicts of interest and employee investments. If Melissa had used her position at Pinnacle to secure funding for her own startup without proper disclosure, she could be facing serious professional consequences. Through public filings and industry databases, I discovered that Pinnacle's investment in FitSync had been structured as a traditional seed round, with standard terms and investor protections. But what wasn't public was whether Melissa had properly disclosed her role in originating the deal and her relationship with the founding team. I also researched the other investors in their funding round. Startup investments typically involve extensive due diligence, including verification of intellectual property ownership, founder backgrounds, and business plan originality. If their investors had been misled about the true origins of FitSync's business concept, they might have grounds for legal action. The competitive landscape research revealed another interesting detail. Several other fitness technology startups were working on similar concepts, but none had approached the market with the specific combination of features and positioning that I had developed. FitSync's unique value proposition wasn't just similar to my original concept, it was identical, in ways that couldn't be explained by coincidence or independent development. By this point, I had assembled a substantial collection of evidence that demonstrated Jake and Melissa's deception. Digital timestamps proved I had developed the core concepts months before their startup launched. Recorded conversations showed them inadvertently admitting to shortened development timelines and strategic approaches that matched my planning. Public statements revealed inconsistencies in their origin story and timeline, but I still needed a strategy for using this evidence effectively. Simply publishing my findings online or sending them to investors wouldn't necessarily achieve the justice I was seeking. I needed to identify the most vulnerable aspects of their business and the most effective leverage points for exposing their fraud. The answer came from studying their funding structure and investor relationships more carefully. Venture capital investments aren't just financial transactions. They're built on trust, reputation, and belief in the founding team's integrity. If investors discovered they had been deceived about fundamental aspects of the business, the consequences could be devastating. More importantly, I realized that Melissa's position at Pinnacle Ventures created potential conflicts of interest that might violate industry regulations and firm policies. If she had used insider information or her professional position to benefit her personal investments, she could face serious professional sanctions. Jake's situation was different but equally vulnerable. His employer had strict policies about outside business activities and intellectual property development. If he had used company resources or time to develop FitSync, or if he had failed to properly disclose his outside business activities, he could be facing termination and potentially legal action. The pieces of my strategy were falling into place. I had evidence of their deception, understanding of their vulnerabilities, and identification of the pressure points that could be used to achieve justice. Now, I needed to decide how to deploy this information for maximum impact. The plan I developed was methodical and multifaceted, designed to expose their fraud through multiple channels simultaneously while minimizing the risk of them being able to cover their tracks or retaliate against me. It would require careful timing, strategic communication, and flawless execution. But before I could implement my plan, I needed to gather one final piece of evidence that would make their guilt undeniable. I needed proof that they had deliberately stolen my concept, not just independently developed similar ideas. This required getting them to acknowledge my original ownership of the ideas they had taken. The solution came from an unexpected source. My research into their business operations had revealed that they were actively recruiting additional team members and seeking partnerships with other companies in the fitness space. These activities required them to explain their business model and strategic approach to potential collaborators. I realized I could create a situation where they would unknowingly confess their theft while trying to impress potential partners. All I needed was the right opportunity and the right audience to witness their admission. The opportunity I needed came sooner than expected. Through my network of freelance marketing contacts, I learned that FitSync Technologies was actively seeking a head of marketing to help scale their user acquisition efforts. The position was being recruited through Austin's most exclusive executive search firm, Henderson & Associates, known for their discretion and high-caliber placements. I realized this was my chance to get inside their operation while they were at their most vulnerable and talkative. Startups recruiting senior executives typically engage in extensive discussions about strategy, vision, and competitive positioning. If I could position myself as a serious candidate, I might be able to get them to reveal information they would never share otherwise. The challenge was that Melissa would immediately recognize me if I applied under my real identity, but my years of freelance marketing work had taught me the value of flexibility and reinvention. I had operated under several different professional personas depending on client needs, and I had the skills to create a convincing alternate identity. I created a comprehensive false identity as Victoria Blackwood, a senior marketing executive with experience scaling consumer technology startups. I built her profile carefully, using a combination of real achievements from my freelance career attributed to fictitious companies, and borrowed expertise from marketing professionals I had studied and admired. Victoria's LinkedIn profile showcased 10 years of experience driving user growth at fitness and wellness startups that had actually existed but were now defunct, making verification difficult. Her portfolio included case studies that were based on real campaigns I had executed for clients but reframed as internal startup work rather than consulting projects. The resume I submitted through Henderson and Associates was a masterpiece of creative truth-telling. Every skill, every achievement, every strategic insight was based on real experience I possessed, but packaged in a way that made Victoria Blackwood appear to be exactly the kind of marketing leader that a scaling startup would desperately want to hire. My years of studying successful marketing campaigns and analyzing user acquisition strategies had given me deep expertise that rivaled any traditional corporate marketing executive. The difference was that my knowledge came from working with dozens of different companies rather than climbing the ladder at a single organization. Henderson and Associates responded within 2 days, requesting an initial phone screening. I had prepared extensively for this moment, creating a dedicated phone number and email address for Victoria, and practicing the slightly different speaking, style, and professional terminology that would distinguish her from Sarah Martinez. The phone screening went perfectly. I demonstrated intimate knowledge of fitness industry marketing challenges, user acquisition strategies for mobile apps, and scaling techniques for consumer technology companies. My insights into customer psychology and behavior analytics impressed the recruiter enough to move me forward to the next round. More importantly, the recruiter shared details about FitSync's marketing challenges and growth targets that weren't publicly available. They were struggling with user retention rates that were lower than industry benchmarks, despite their initial success at acquiring downloads. Their cost per acquisition was climbing rapidly as they moved beyond their initial viral growth, and they needed someone who could optimize their conversion funnels and improve lifetime customer value. These challenges aligned perfectly with problems I had anticipated when developing my original business plan. In my research and planning phase, I had identified user retention as the critical success factor for fitness apps and had developed specific strategies for addressing engagement drop-off. The fact that Jake and Melissa were now facing these exact challenges suggested they had implemented my concept without understanding the deeper strategic thinking behind it. The first in-person interview was scheduled for the following week. At FitSync's headquarters, a sleek co-working space in downtown San Francisco that they had rented after their funding round. I flew to California as Victoria Blackwood, complete with a new wardrobe that reflected the polished corporate aesthetic that would be expected from a senior marketing executive. Walking into their office was surreal. The walls were covered with user interface mock-ups and growth charts that looked exactly like materials I had created during my planning process. Their user personas, printed and mounted around the office, were identical to research I had conducted months earlier. Even their color scheme and branding choices matched aesthetic decisions I had made for my original concept. Jake was present for the interview, along with Melissa and 2 other team members I didn't recognize. Seeing them together in their professional environment was jarring. They had transformed my vision into a functioning business, complete with employees, investors, and real users. The success I had dreamed of achieving was happening right in front of me, but I was experiencing it as an outsider looking in. Jake didn't recognize me initially. My appearance as Victoria was significantly different from how he knew Sarah, and the context was so unexpected that his brain didn't make the connection. But I could see him studying my face during the interview, trying to place where he might have seen me before. Melissa was completely focused on evaluating my qualifications and fit with their company culture. She asked detailed questions about my experience with user acquisition, retention strategies, and scaling marketing operations. I answered with confidence and expertise, drawing on real experience while maintaining the Victoria persona. The interview provided incredible insights into their operation and mindset. They described their vision for FitSync as if it had emerged organically from their partnership, with no acknowledgement of outside influences or inspiration. Melissa spoke passionately about identifying market gaps and developing innovative solutions, presenting herself as the strategic mastermind behind their success. Jake discussed the technical challenges they had overcome and the development decisions that had shaped their product. His explanations revealed that they had encountered exactly the technical hurdles I had anticipated and researched solutions for during my planning phase. But rather than acknowledging the research that had informed their approach, he presented their solutions as innovative problem-solving achieved through trial and error. Most revealing was their discussion of future plans and strategic priorities. Their roadmap included features and expansion strategies that matched my original business plan almost exactly. They were planning to add social coaching features, corporate wellness partnerships, and integration with wearable devices, all components I had outlined during my conversations with Melissa months earlier. When they asked about my approach to user retention challenges, I decided to test their knowledge by describing strategies that were directly based on research I had shared with Melissa. I outlined user engagement frameworks and behavioral psychology principles that I had discovered during my planning process. Their response was telling. Melissa immediately became animated, explaining how my suggestions aligned perfectly with their internal thinking and strategic direction. She described retention challenges they were facing and solutions they were considering, using language and concepts that were identical to notes from my original planning documents. Jake nodded along enthusiastically, adding technical details about implementation approaches that matched solutions we had discussed during our relationship. Neither of them showed any recognition that they were hearing their own stolen ideas presented back to them by someone who should have been a stranger. The interview concluded with them expressing strong interest in bringing Victoria on board as their head of marketing. They described the role as an opportunity to scale a proven concept with significant backing and strong market traction. Melissa emphasized that they were looking for someone who could think strategically about long-term growth while executing aggressively on near-term objectives. As I left their office, I realized I had accomplished something remarkable. Not only had I gathered detailed information about their operation and strategic thinking, but I had also demonstrated that my marketing expertise was exactly what they needed to solve their current challenges. They wanted to hire me to help them succeed with the business they had stolen from me. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. But the interview had also revealed something concerning about their level of preparation and strategic thinking. While they had executed my concept successfully in the short term, they were already encountering problems that suggested they didn't fully understand the market dynamics and customer psychology that had informed my original planning. Their user retention rates were declining because they hadn't implemented the community-building features that were central to my concept. Their acquisition costs were rising because they were using generic growth marketing tactics rather than the targeted approaches I had developed based on user research. They were treating FitSync like a typical consumer app rather than the specialized wellness platform I had envisioned. This realization sparked a new dimension to my planning. Rather than simply exposing their theft and seeking revenge, I could potentially use my insider knowledge to undermine their business while building my own competing venture. If they didn't truly understand what made my concept valuable, they would be vulnerable to competition from someone who did. But first, I needed to complete my evidence gathering and finalize my strategy for exposing their fraud. The second interview was scheduled for the following week, this time including meetings with their investors and board members. This presented an opportunity to gather information about their funding relationships and investor communications. If I could document discrepancies between their public statements and their private admissions, I would have additional leverage for my eventual confrontation. I prepared extensively for the investor meeting, researching the backgrounds and investment philosophies of everyone who would be present. Pinnacle Ventures was represented by Chen, the partner who had led their investment round. 2 other investors were participating: Jennifer Walsh from Austin Ventures and David Kim from a family office that had contributed to their seed round. The investor meeting took place at Pinnacle's San Francisco offices, a sleek space designed to impress entrepreneurs and reflect the firm's success. I arrived as Victoria Blackwood, confident and prepared to discuss marketing strategy with some of the most sophisticated investors in the technology sector. Chen opened the meeting by describing FitSync as an example of Pinnacle's approach to identifying exceptional founders with innovative concepts. He praised Melissa's strategic vision and Jake's technical execution, presenting their partnership as a perfect combination of business acumen and development expertise. Jennifer Walsh asked detailed questions about user metrics and growth projections, pushing for specifics about customer acquisition costs, lifetime value calculations, and retention trends. I listened carefully to their responses, noting discrepancies between the numbers they shared with investors and the challenges they had described during my marketing interview. David Kim focused on competitive positioning and market timing, wanting to understand how FitSync differentiated itself from other fitness technology companies. Melissa's response to this question was particularly revealing, as she described their unique approach using language and concepts that were directly lifted from my original competitive analysis. When the conversation turned to marketing strategy and my potential role, I had the opportunity to demonstrate expertise while testing their knowledge. I described user acquisition frameworks and retention strategies that were based on research I had conducted for my original business plan, presenting them as general industry best practices. The investors responded positively to my insights, but Melissa and Jake's reactions were even more telling. They clearly recognized the concepts I was describing, nodding along and adding details that revealed intimate familiarity with the strategic thinking behind my suggestions. But they presented this familiarity as their own internal knowledge rather than acknowledging any outside sources. Chen asked about my experience with similar user retention challenges, and I described case studies that were loosely based on real situations I had analyzed during my planning phase. I outlined the psychological principles behind user engagement in fitness applications and the importance of community features in driving long-term adoption. Melissa immediately jumped in to explain how my observations aligned with their product roadmap and strategic priorities. She described features they were planning to implement and user research they had conducted, using frameworks and methodologies that matched my original planning documents almost exactly. The meeting concluded with strong enthusiasm from all participants about bringing Victoria on board as head of marketing. The investors clearly saw my expertise as valuable for scaling their investment, and Melissa and Jake were eager to access strategic thinking that would help them address their current challenges. But what they didn't realize was that they had just spent 90 minutes demonstrating their theft of my intellectual property to a room full of sophisticated investors. Their intimate familiarity with strategic concepts that should have been foreign to them, combined with their detailed knowledge of research methodologies they claimed to have developed independently, created a pattern that would be difficult to explain if examined closely. After the meeting, I lingered in Pinnacle's lobby area, observing conversations between the team members and investors. In casual post-meeting discussions, people often revealed information they wouldn't share in formal settings. I positioned myself near the coffee station where I could overhear without appearing to eavesdrop. Melissa was discussing timeline and onboarding plans with Chen, describing their urgency to scale marketing efforts before competitors caught up to their early success. She mentioned that they had been incredibly fortunate to identify market opportunities so quickly and develop solutions that resonated with users from launch. Marcus responded by praising her market research and strategic planning, noting that their business plan had been one of the most comprehensive and well-researched proposals Pinnacle had reviewed that year. He specifically mentioned being impressed by the depth of user psychology research and competitive analysis that had informed their approach. This comment was particularly significant because it suggested that Melissa had presented my research and planning work as her own when seeking investment. The comprehensive business plan that had impressed Pinnacle wasn't the result of Melissa's strategic thinking. It was based on months of research and analysis I had conducted and shared with her during our weekend in San Francisco. Jake was having a separate conversation with Jennifer Walsh about technical architecture and development timelines. He was describing their rapid development process and the efficiency they had achieved by having clear technical specifications from the beginning of the project. Jennifer seemed impressed by their ability to move from concept to launch so quickly, attributing it to strong technical leadership and clear product vision. but Jake's explanation revealed that their speed had been possible because they had started with detailed technical requirements and user interface specifications rather than developing these from scratch. The specifications he was crediting for their efficiency were based on technical planning I had completed during my original concept development. I had spent weeks researching technical architectures, user interface design principles, and development frameworks specifically for fitness applications. Jake and Melissa had benefited from this research without having to invest the time and effort required to conduct it themselves. As I left Pinnacle's offices, I realized I had gathered compelling evidence that Jake and Melissa had misrepresented the origins of their business concept to investors. Their funding had been secured based on strategic thinking and research they had presented as their own work, but which was actually based on planning I had completed months earlier. This misrepresentation potentially constituted fraud, particularly if investors had made decisions based on false information about the founding team's capabilities and the originality of their business concept. More importantly, it gave me leverage that could be used to demand justice and accountability. But I still needed to document their acknowledgement of my original ownership more explicitly. The evidence I had gathered was compelling, but largely circumstantial. I needed them to admit, in their own words, that they had built their business using ideas and research that weren't originally theirs. The solution came from an unexpected source. During my preparation for the investor meeting, I had learned that FitSync was planning to participate in an upcoming industry conference where Melissa would be speaking on a panel about successful startup launches. The panel would include other entrepreneurs who had built businesses in the fitness and wellness space, and it would be moderated by a prominent industry journalist. I realized this conference presented an opportunity to create a situation where Melissa would be challenged to explain the origins of her strategic thinking in front of an audience of industry experts. If I could arrange for specific questions to be asked about her research methodologies and concept development process, she might reveal information that would support my case. The conference was being held in Austin, which meant I could attend without the expense and complexity of traveling as Victoria Blackwood. But more importantly, it would take place in my home market, where I had professional relationships and influence that could be leveraged to shape the agenda and questioning. I began reaching out to contacts in the local startup community, identifying people who would be attending the conference and who might be willing to ask pointed questions during the panel discussion. I framed my requests as professional curiosity about successful founder strategies without revealing my personal connection to FitSync or my suspicions about their business practices. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would force Melissa to explain her success in front of an audience that included many people who knew my background and expertise in fitness marketing. If she continued to claim original ownership of strategic concepts that were actually based on my research, she would be doing so in front of witnesses who could potentially verify my prior work in the space. Everything was falling into place for the next phase of my plan. The Austin Tech Summit was the perfect stage for what I had planned. The 3-day conference drew hundreds of entrepreneurs, investors, and industry professionals from across the Southwest, creating an environment where business reputations could be made or destroyed based on a single presentation or panel discussion. Melissa's speaking slot was scheduled for the second day, a panel titled From Concept to Scale: Rapid Startup Success Stories. She would be joined by 3 other entrepreneurs who had achieved significant growth in their first year of operation, discussing strategies for moving from initial idea to market traction. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, not just gathering evidence, but orchestrating the circumstances that would force the truth into the open. Through my network of freelance marketing contacts, I had identified key attendees who would be present and influential voices who could amplify whatever revelations emerged from the panel. The moderator was Chen, a respected technology journalist who had built her reputation on asking tough questions and uncovering inconsistencies in startup narratives. I had reached out to Rebecca through mutual professional connections, sharing some general concerns about founder authenticity in the current startup environment without revealing my specific situation. Rebecca was intrigued by the broader issue of idea attribution and intellectual property in the startup world. We had discussed the challenges of verifying founder stories and the importance of press accountability in an ecosystem where narratives could be easily fabricated or exaggerated. My conversation with Rebecca hadn't directly mentioned FitSync or Melissa, but I had provided her with enough context about questionable founding stories that she would be primed to ask probing questions about concept development and original research during the panel. I also reached out to several attendees who knew my background in fitness marketing, people who had seen my work and presentations over the years. I didn't reveal my suspicions about FitSync, but I mentioned that I would be interested in their thoughts on the panel discussion and whether the strategies described aligned with current industry best practices. The morning of Melissa's panel, I positioned myself strategically in the audience. I chose a seat in the front section where I would be visible to the panelists, but not so prominent that I would immediately draw attention. I wanted Melissa to see me during her presentation, but only after she had committed to specific claims about her process and timeline. The panel began with each entrepreneur providing an overview of their business and growth trajectory. Melissa's presentation was polished and confident, describing FitSync's journey from initial concept to funded startup in less than a year. She emphasized their rapid development timeline and the efficiency they had achieved through strategic planning and market research. Rebecca's first questions focused on the ideation process and how each founder had identified their market opportunity. This was exactly the opening I had hoped for, and Melissa's response was even more revealing than I had anticipated. She described her inspiration for FitSync as emerging from personal experience with fitness motivation challenges, combined with observations about gaps in the current app marketplace. She outlined a research process that included user interviews, competitive analysis, and behavioral psychology studies that had informed their product development. Every element of the research process she described matched work I had completed and shared with her during our weekend in San Francisco. She was presenting my methodology as her own discovery, using language and frameworks that were identical to my original planning documents. Rebecca followed up by asking about the timeline for concept development and when Melissa had first begun researching fitness technology solutions. Melissa's response placed her initial research several months before our San Francisco meeting, directly contradicting the timeline I could document through digital records and saved communications. The third panelist, whose startup focused on nutrition tracking, asked Melissa about her approach to user psychology research and behavioral design principles. This question prompted Melissa to discuss specific psychological frameworks and motivation, theories that I had researched extensively during my planning phase. Her detailed knowledge of these concepts would have been impressive if it had been legitimate, but I knew she was describing research findings and strategic insights that she had learned from me, not through independent study. The depth and specificity of her responses demonstrated access to comprehensive research that would have taken months to complete. As the panel continued, Melissa became increasingly confident and expansive in her responses. She described technical architecture decisions, user interface design principles, and market positioning strategies that aligned perfectly with planning documents I had created. She was essentially giving a presentation based on my business plan, while presenting it as her own strategic thinking. Rebecca seemed intrigued by the comprehensiveness of Melissa's preparation and asked about her background in fitness and wellness industries prior to launching FitSync. This question created an opening for Melissa to acknowledge outside influences or collaboration, but instead she doubled down on her narrative of independent discovery and research. Melissa claimed that her interest in fitness technology had developed over several years of personal struggle with motivation and consistency. She described conducting informal user research among friends and colleagues, discovering pain points that weren't being addressed by existing solutions. This personal narrative was completely fabricated. I knew Melissa's actual relationship with fitness and wellness, which had been minimal until she started working on FitSync. Her claimed user, research and market insights were based on work I had conducted, not on her own experience or investigation. 20 minutes into the panel discussion, I made my move. During a brief pause between questions, I stood up and addressed the moderator directly. Rebecca, I have a question about intellectual property and idea attribution in the startup world. How should founders handle situations where their concepts have been influenced by outside research or collaboration? What's the ethical approach to acknowledging sources of inspiration or strategic input? The question was perfectly positioned to seem like general industry inquiry while creating pressure for Melissa to address the issue of attribution directly. Rebecca responded positively, noting that transparency about influences and collaborations was crucial for maintaining credibility in the startup ecosystem. She turned the question to the panel, asking each founder to discuss their approach to acknowledging outside influences and collaborative input in their development process. The other panelists gave thoughtful responses about mentors, advisors, and research sources that had shaped their thinking. When the question reached Melissa, she paused for several seconds before responding. I could see her processing the implications of the question and trying to determine the safest way to respond. Her answer was carefully crafted, but ultimately revealed more than she intended. Melissa acknowledged that successful entrepreneurs benefit from extensive networks and diverse perspectives, but she emphasized that FitSync's core concept and strategic direction had emerged from her own analysis and vision. She described building on general industry knowledge and common startup methodologies without crediting specific sources or individuals. Her response was technically accurate, but deliberately misleading. By describing my specific research and strategic frameworks as general industry knowledge, she was minimizing the originality and value of work that had been crucial to their success. Rebecca pressed further, asking about the specific research methodologies Melissa had used for user psychology analysis and market positioning. This follow-up question forced Melissa to either admit she had used outside research or provide detailed explanations of work she had claimed to conduct independently. Melissa chose to elaborate on her methodology, describing research approaches and analytical frameworks that matched my original work with remarkable precision. She discussed user interview techniques, behavioral analysis methods, and competitive positioning strategies that were identical to approaches I had developed and documented. As she spoke, I began taking notes on my phone, recording specific phrases and methodological descriptions that I could later verify against my original planning documents. Several people in the audience, including contacts who knew my background, were also taking notes and seemed intrigued by the sophistication of her described research process. The most damaging moment came when Rebecca asked about the timeline for user research and how long the analysis phase had taken before moving into development. Melissa's response revealed that she claimed to have completed comprehensive market research and user analysis in just 6 weeks, a timeline that would be nearly impossible for someone working independently without prior knowledge or framework. She described conducting user interviews, analyzing competitive positioning, researching behavioral psychology principles, and developing strategic frameworks, all within this compressed time frame. Anyone with experience in market research would recognize that this timeline was implausible for the depth of work she was describing, but Melissa had become so confident in her narrative that she began adding details that made her story even less credible. She claimed to have interviewed over 50 potential users, analyzed dozens of competing products, and conducted extensive literature review of academic research on motivation psychology. This level of research would typically require months of full-time work or access to existing research that had already been compiled and analyzed. Her claim to have completed it in 6 weeks while maintaining her full-time position at Pinnacle Ventures was simply not believable. As the panel discussion continued, I noticed several audience members exchanging glances and taking notes. The startup community in Austin was relatively small, and many attendees knew each other's backgrounds and capabilities. Melissa's claims about her research timeline and methodology were being evaluated by people with direct experience in market research and product development. During the networking break that followed the panel, I moved strategically through the audience, positioning myself near conversations where Melissa's presentation was being discussed. The reactions were mixed but telling. Several people seemed impressed by the comprehensiveness of her research, but others were questioning the feasibility of her described timeline. I overheard one conversation between two marketing professionals who specialized in consumer research. They were discussing the implausibility of conducting the level of user psychology research Melissa had described within her claimed time frame, especially while maintaining a demanding full-time position. Another conversation involved two entrepreneurs who had built fitness-related businesses. They were comparing Melissa's described methodology to their own research processes and noting similarities to frameworks that were typically developed by specialized consultants rather than first-time founders. These conversations confirmed that industry professionals were already questioning aspects of Melissa's narrative, but I needed to provide them with specific information that would allow them to verify their suspicions and understand the full scope of what had occurred. During the extended networking session, I approached several individuals who had seemed most intrigued by the panel discussion. I introduced myself using my real identity for the first time in months, explaining that I was a freelance marketing consultant who specialized in fitness and wellness industries. I mentioned that I had been interested in Melissa's research methodology because it aligned closely with approaches I had been developing for my own clients. I asked if they had noticed any similarities to existing frameworks or methodologies in her presentation. The responses were immediate and revealing. Multiple people confirmed that they had recognized specific research approaches and analytical frameworks that seemed familiar from other sources. Some mentioned seeing similar methodologies in industry publications or conference presentations from previous years. I carefully shared that I had been developing similar frameworks for client work and had documented much of my research over the past several years. I offered to provide comparative materials that might help them evaluate the originality of the approaches Melissa had described. Several people expressed strong interest in seeing my work, particularly the two marketing professionals who had been questioning Melissa's timeline. They understood the importance of intellectual property in the consulting world and were concerned about potential misappropriation of research methodologies. I arranged to send detailed documentation of my original research and planning work to these contacts, along with timestamps and digital records that proved the development timeline of my concepts and methodologies. This would allow them to make independent comparisons and draw their own conclusions about the similarities. But my most important conversation was with Chen, the panel moderator. I approached her during a quiet moment and thanked her for asking such insightful questions about research methodology and attribution. I mentioned that her questions had highlighted important issues about transparency in the startup world. Rebecca was intrigued by my perspective and asked about my background in the fitness industry. I explained my work as a marketing consultant and mentioned that I had been developing business concepts in the fitness technology space for several years. When I described some of my research approaches and strategic frameworks, Rebecca immediately noted the similarities to what Melissa had presented during the panel. She asked if I had published any of my work or presented it at industry events, where others might have been exposed to my methodologies. I explained that most of my work had been developed for client projects and hadn't been published publicly, but that I had comprehensive documentation of my research process and timeline. Rebecca suggested that if I was concerned about potential misappropriation of my work, I should consider documenting my concerns and sharing them with relevant industry organizations. This conversation with Rebecca was crucial because it established a legitimate journalistic interest in investigating potential intellectual property issues in the startup world. As a respected technology journalist, her involvement would add credibility to any revelations that emerged from my documentation. Over the following weeks, I systematically shared my evidence with the contacts I had made at the conference. I provided comprehensive documentation of my original research, including timestamps, digital records, and detailed planning documents that proved I had developed the concepts Melissa claimed as her own. The response from industry professionals was swift and decisive. The marketing specialists confirmed that my research methodologies and strategic frameworks were identical to what Melissa had presented, but with documentation proving I had developed them months earlier. The entrepreneurs who had questioned Melissa's timeline verified that the level of research she claimed to have completed would have been impossible within her stated time frame without access to existing work that had already been compiled and analyzed. Most importantly, Chen began investigating the broader implications of intellectual property misappropriation in startup funding and founder narratives. Her initial research revealed that several other startups had faced questions about the originality of their business concepts and research methodologies. The investigation Rebecca launched would eventually expose not just Melissa's theft of my work, but also systematic issues with due diligence and verification processes in the venture capital industry. Her reporting would lead to changes in how investors evaluate founder claims and verify the originality of business concepts. But the immediate impact on FitSync was devastating. Within 6 weeks of the Austin Tech Summit panel, Rebecca published a comprehensive investigation into intellectual property issues in startup funding that featured FitSync as a primary case study. The article included detailed comparisons between my original research and Melissa's claims, supported by timestamps and digital records that proved my prior development of the concepts she had presented as her own. It also featured interviews with industry professionals who had attended the panel and verified the implausibility of Melissa's claimed research timeline. The response from FitSync's investors was immediate and severe. Pinnacle Ventures launched an internal investigation into potential misrepresentation in Melissa's investment materials and presentation. The other investors in their funding round demanded detailed explanations and documentation of their research and development process. Jake's employer began investigating his outside business activities and use of company resources for FitSync development. His failure to properly disclose his startup involvement and potential conflicts of interest resulted in immediate suspension and eventual termination. Melissa faced professional sanctions from Pinnacle Ventures for failing to disclose conflicts of interest and potentially misrepresenting information to investors. Her position at the firm became untenable as the investigation revealed additional ethical violations related to her handling of the FitSync investment. The competitive advantage that FitSync had gained through access to my research and strategic planning began to erode as their user metrics declined and their growth trajectory flattened. Without understanding the deeper psychological principles and strategic thinking that had informed my original concept, they were unable to address the retention and engagement challenges that emerged as their initial viral growth phase ended. Within 6 months, FitSync had lost most of its investor support and was struggling to maintain operations. Several key team members left for other opportunities, and their user base began migrating to competing applications that offered more comprehensive and strategically developed features. The personal cost to Melissa and Jake extended beyond their professional consequences. Their romantic relationship, which had been built on shared deception and stolen success, collapsed under the pressure of public scrutiny and legal challenges. Jake moved back to Austin and eventually found work at a smaller technology company, while Melissa left the venture capital industry entirely. For me, the vindication was complete, but came with unexpected complexity. The exposure of their theft validated my original vision and strategic thinking, but it also meant acknowledging that I had lost valuable time and momentum in bringing my concept to market. However, the industry attention generated by Rebecca's investigation had also created new opportunities. Several investors and potential partners reached out to discuss my original research and strategic frameworks, recognizing the value of my work independently of the FitSync controversy. I used this interest to launch my own consulting practice focused on helping legitimate startups develop comprehensive market research and strategic planning. My experience with intellectual property theft had given me unique insights into protecting and documenting innovative work, expertise that proved valuable to other entrepreneurs. The fitness technology concept that had been stolen from me eventually found new life through a partnership with an established wellness company that recognized the value of my strategic approach. While I never launched FitSync as originally envisioned, the core concepts and research methodologies I developed became the foundation for multiple successful projects. The most satisfying outcome was the broader impact on industry practices around intellectual property and founder verification. Rebecca's investigation led to enhanced due diligence procedures among venture capital firms and greater awareness of attribution issues in startup development. Professional organizations began implementing guidelines for documenting and protecting innovative work, and industry conferences started including sessions on ethical collaboration and intellectual property protection. The changes helped protect other entrepreneurs from experiencing the kind of theft I had endured. Looking back, the betrayal by Melissa and Jake had been devastating in the moment, but ultimately led to outcomes I could never have anticipated. Their theft had cost me time, emotional energy, and financial opportunity, but the process of seeking justice had revealed strengths and capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. The strategic thinking, investigative skills, and professional network I developed during my pursuit of accountability became the foundation for a more successful and fulfilling career than I had originally envisioned. Instead of being defined by what was stolen from me, I became known for my expertise in protecting and developing innovative concepts. The final irony was that Melissa and Jake's attempt to shortcut their way to success had ultimately cost them far more than they had gained. Their theft had provided temporary advantage, but had required them to build their entire professional reputation on a foundation of deception that was destined to collapse. In contrast, the long and difficult process of seeking justice had forced me to develop genuine expertise, authentic relationships, and sustainable competitive advantages that no one could steal. The work I had put into exposing their fraud had also made me a better entrepreneur and a more strategic thinker. The lesson I learned was that while betrayal and theft can cause tremendous pain in the short term, authenticity and persistence ultimately triumph over deception and shortcuts. The truth has a way of emerging, especially when someone is determined to ensure that justice is served. Melissa and Jake had thought they were stealing my future, but instead, they had given me the motivation and opportunity to build something far better than my original vision. Their betrayal had been the catalyst for achievements and recognition that exceeded anything I could have accomplished through the original FitSync concept. 3 years later, I stood on the stage at the same Austin Tech Summit where I had exposed their theft, this time as a keynote speaker discussing innovation protection and authentic entrepreneurship. In the audience were young entrepreneurs who were learning from my experience and building their own ventures on foundations of integrity and original thinking. The journey from betrayal to vindication to success had been longer and more challenging than I ever could have imagined, but it had also been more rewarding than simply achieving my original goals would have been. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from getting what we thought we wanted, but from discovering what we're truly capable of when faced with our greatest challenges. The morning after the Austin Tech Summit panel, I woke up with a strange sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. The adrenaline rush of confronting Melissa publicly had given way to something deeper and more sustainable. The quiet confidence that comes from knowing you've played your hand perfectly. But I also knew that the real work was just beginning. Exposing someone's lies in front of an audience is one thing. Making sure the consequences stick and the truth spreads is an entirely different challenge. My phone had been buzzing constantly since the previous evening. Messages from conference attendees, connection requests on LinkedIn, and emails from people who had witnessed the panel discussion and wanted to know more about the intellectual property issues I had raised. The most important message came from Chen, who wanted to schedule an in-depth interview about my allegations and the documentation I had mentioned. I spent the morning organizing my evidence into a comprehensive package that would tell the complete story of Melissa and Jake's theft. Every document was meticulously labeled with timestamps and source information. Every piece of digital evidence was backed up in multiple formats. I had learned from studying other cases of intellectual property disputes that the difference between winning and losing often came down to the quality and organization of documentation. The package I assembled was devastating in its completeness. It included my original business plan with metadata showing creation dates months before Melissa and Jake's supposed brainstorming sessions. Screenshots of conversations where I had shared specific ideas and strategic frameworks with both of them. Digital archives of my research process, including browser histories and saved articles that proved when I had discovered key insights they later claimed as their own discoveries. But the most damning evidence was the audio recordings I had made during my meetings with them as Victoria Blackwood. In those recordings, they had unknowingly confessed to timelines and processes that contradicted their public narrative. Jake had admitted that their development had taken only 3 months, not the year-long process they claimed in interviews. Melissa had described strategic insights as obvious and fundamental, revealing that she didn't truly understand the research and analysis that had led to those conclusions. When I met with Chen that afternoon, I brought printed copies of everything along with digital files organized in a way that would make her investigation as straightforward as possible. Rebecca was a thorough journalist who had built her reputation on exposing inconsistencies and holding entrepreneurs accountable for their claims. But even she seemed surprised by the comprehensiveness of the evidence I presented. We spent 3 hours going through the documentation, with Rebecca asking detailed questions about timelines, development processes, and the specific instances where my work had been appropriated. She was particularly interested in the recordings from my Victoria Blackwood meetings, which provided direct evidence of Melissa and Jake's deception in their own words. Rebecca explained that she had been investigating broader issues of intellectual property theft in the startup world for several months, following tips and complaints from entrepreneurs who believed their work had been stolen. My case was unusual because of the comprehensive documentation and the clear timeline of events, but it fit into a larger pattern she was uncovering. She told me about other cases where founders had built businesses on stolen concepts, using their access to networks and capital to execute ideas that originated with less connected entrepreneurs. The venture capital industry's emphasis on execution over innovation had created an environment where idea theft was both easy to accomplish and difficult to prove. My case was different because I had anticipated the possibility of theft and had documented my work accordingly. Most entrepreneurs trusted their collaborators and didn't maintain the kind of detailed records that would be necessary to prove intellectual property violations. The fact that I had preserved so much evidence was both unusual and incredibly valuable for establishing the broader pattern Rebecca was investigating. After our meeting, Rebecca began her own investigation into FitSync's claims and investor communications. As a technology journalist with established relationships throughout the venture capital community, she had access to sources and verification methods that I couldn't pursue independently. She reached out to Pinnacle Ventures for comment, interviewed other entrepreneurs who had built fitness technology companies, and spoke with technical experts who could evaluate the plausibility of Jake and Melissa's development timeline. While Rebecca conducted her investigation, I focused on building support within the Austin startup community. The connections I had made at the conference were eager to learn more about my allegations, particularly the marketing professionals who had questioned Melissa's research timeline during the panel discussion. I organized informal meetings with groups of entrepreneurs and investors, sharing my story and documentation in settings where people could ask questions and examine the evidence closely. These sessions weren't about seeking sympathy or support. They were about establishing facts and letting experienced professionals draw their own conclusions about what had occurred. The response from the startup community was overwhelmingly supportive, but more importantly, it was informed and professional. People with experience in product development and market research could see immediately that Melissa's claimed timeline was implausible. Venture capital professionals recognized the red flags in FitSync's funding narrative. Technical experts understood that Jake's development schedule would have been impossible without pre-existing specifications and research. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. One of the investors I had met at the conference, David Park from Austin Ventures, revealed that his firm had been approached by FitSync seeking additional funding just weeks before the conference. During their due diligence process, they had noticed inconsistencies in the founding story and had requested additional documentation about the origins of the business concept. David explained that FitSync had been unable to provide satisfactory evidence of their independent research and development process. When pressed for details about their market analysis and user research, Melissa had become evasive and had ultimately withdrawn their funding request rather than provide the documentation Austin Ventures required. This revelation was crucial because it demonstrated that professional investors with experience in due diligence had already identified problems with FitSync's narrative. It wasn't just my word against theirs. Sophisticated financial professionals had reached similar conclusions about the credibility of their claims. David offered to provide a statement for Rebecca's investigation, describing the inconsistencies his firm had identified and the reasons they had declined to pursue the investment opportunity. This kind of support from a respected venture capital firm would add significant credibility to the allegations and make it much harder for FitSync to dismiss the concerns as personal grievances. As word spread through the startup community about the intellectual property issues surrounding FitSync, other problems began to emerge. Several developers who had worked with Jake on contract projects came forward with concerns about his approach to intellectual property and attribution. They described instances where he had claimed credit for solutions and innovations that had been developed collaboratively or by other team members. These revelations suggested that Jake's tendency to appropriate other people's work extended beyond my specific case. He had apparently built his reputation as a technical innovator partly on the foundation of other people's ideas and contributions. This pattern of behavior made my allegations more credible and suggested that the theft of my business concept was part of a broader pattern rather than an isolated incident. Melissa faced similar scrutiny as former colleagues and collaborators began sharing their own experiences with her approach to attribution and credit. Several people described situations where she had presented collaborative work as her own individual achievements, particularly when communicating with senior partners at Pinnacle Ventures about her professional accomplishments. The picture that emerged was of two people who had built their professional reputations partly through appropriating other people's work and claiming credit for collaborative achievements. My case was the most egregious example, but it fit into a pattern of behavior that had been developing over years. 3 weeks after the Austin Tech Summit, Rebecca published her investigation into intellectual property theft in the startup world. The article was comprehensive and damning, featuring my case as the primary example but including information about broader patterns of idea appropriation and the systemic issues that made such theft possible. The article included detailed comparisons between my original work and FitSync's business plan, supported by timestamps and digital evidence that made the theft undeniable. It featured quotes from industry professionals who had evaluated the evidence and confirmed that the similarities were too extensive and specific to be coincidental. But the article went beyond just documenting the theft. It explored the broader implications for the startup ecosystem, including the responsibility of investors to verify founder claims and the need for better protection of intellectual property in collaborative environments. Rebecca had used my case to illuminate systemic problems that affected many entrepreneurs and investors. The response to the article was immediate and widespread. Technology publications picked up the story, expanding on Rebecca's reporting and exploring additional angles. Venture capital firms began reviewing their due diligence processes and implementing new verification procedures. Startup accelerators and incubators started providing education about intellectual property protection and documentation. For FitSync, the consequences were swift and devastating. Pinnacle Ventures announced that they were conducting a comprehensive review of their investment and the circumstances surrounding the funding decision. The other investors in FitSync's seed round demanded detailed explanations and began exploring their legal options for recovering their investments. Jake's situation became untenable almost immediately. His employer's investigation revealed that he had used company resources and development tools for FitSync work without proper authorization. More damaging was the discovery that he had been interviewing for other positions while claiming to be fully committed to his current role. The combination of policy violations and credibility issues resulted in his immediate termination. Melissa's position at Pinnacle Ventures was even more precarious. The firm's investigation revealed that she had failed to disclose potential conflicts of interest when recommending FitSync for investment. She had also misrepresented her role in developing the business concept, claiming credit for strategic thinking and research that she had not conducted independently. The professional consequences for Melissa extended beyond her immediate employment. The venture capital industry is built on trust and reputation, and the revelation that she had misled investors about fundamental aspects of a deal she had championed damaged her credibility throughout the sector. Several other investments she had recommended came under scrutiny as partners questioned whether she had been equally deceptive about other opportunities. But the most satisfying consequence was the impact on FitSync's business operations. Without the deep understanding of user psychology and market dynamics that had informed my original concept, they were unable to address the retention and engagement challenges that had emerged as their initial growth slowed. Their user metrics began declining as competitors with more sophisticated understanding of fitness motivation launched superior products. The viral growth that had characterized their early success proved unsustainable without the strategic framework and user research that I had developed to support long-term engagement. Customer reviews began reflecting frustration with features that seemed promising initially, but failed to deliver lasting motivation and behavior change. Users complained about a lack of community features and social accountability mechanisms that had been central to my original vision, but which Jake and Melissa had never fully understood or implemented effectively. The competitive advantage they had gained through stealing my research and strategic planning began evaporating as their fundamental lack of understanding became apparent in their product decisions and market positioning. They had successfully executed my initial concept, but they lacked the deeper knowledge necessary to evolve and improve the product based on user feedback and market changes. 6 months after Rebecca's article was published, FitSync was struggling to maintain operations. Their user base had declined by more than 60% from its peak, and their monthly revenue had dropped correspondingly. Several key employees had left for more stable opportunities, and their attempts to raise additional funding had been unsuccessful. Jake had moved back to Austin and was working as a freelance developer, taking on projects that were far less prestigious and lucrative than his previous position. His reputation in the technology community had been severely damaged, and he was finding it difficult to secure employment with established companies that valued integrity and ethical behavior. Melissa had left the venture capital industry entirely and was reportedly considering a career change to a field where her professional reputation wouldn't be a liability. Her departure from Pinnacle Ventures had been described as mutual agreement, but industry insiders understood that she had been forced out due to the credibility issues surrounding the FitSync investment. For me, the vindication was complete, but came with complexities I hadn't anticipated. The public exposure of their theft had validated my work and demonstrated the value of my strategic thinking, but it had also consumed months of my life and emotional energy that I could have invested in moving forward with new projects. However, the process of seeking justice had also created unexpected opportunities. The industry attention generated by Rebecca's investigation had established me as an expert in intellectual property protection and authentic innovation. Entrepreneurs and investors began reaching out for advice about documenting their work and verifying the originality of business concepts. I launched a consulting practice focused on helping startups protect their intellectual property and develop comprehensive strategic planning that would be difficult to steal or replicate. My experience with theft had given me unique insights into the vulnerabilities that entrepreneurs faced and the measures that could be taken to protect innovative work. The consulting practice grew rapidly as awareness of intellectual property issues increased throughout the startup community. I worked with accelerators and incubators to develop educational programs about documentation and protection. I advised venture capital firms on improved due diligence processes that would help them identify and avoid investments based on stolen concepts. But the most rewarding aspect of my new career was working directly with entrepreneurs who were developing innovative concepts in competitive markets. I helped them document their work, protect their ideas, and build businesses on foundations of authentic research and original thinking. The fitness technology concept that had been stolen from me eventually found new life through a partnership with an established wellness company that recognized the value of my strategic approach. While I never launched FitSync as originally envisioned, the research methodologies and user engagement frameworks I had developed became the foundation for multiple successful projects in the health and wellness space. The collaboration with the wellness company was everything my original startup plan should have been. Working with experienced partners who valued my expertise and attributed my contributions appropriately, I was able to see my vision implemented in ways that exceeded my original expectations. The products we developed together achieved the user engagement and long-term behavior change goals that had been central to my initial concept. More importantly, the partnership allowed me to focus on what I did best: strategic thinking and user research, while leaving technical implementation and business operations to partners with complementary skills and established infrastructure. The collaboration was built on mutual respect and transparent communication, everything that my relationships with Jake and Melissa had lacked. 3 years after the Austin Tech Summit panel, where I had first confronted Melissa publicly, I was invited to return as a keynote speaker. The conference organizers wanted me to discuss intellectual property protection and the importance of authentic innovation in the startup ecosystem. Standing on the same stage where I had exposed their theft, I reflected on the journey from betrayal to vindication to success. The experience had been far more challenging than simply achieving my original goals would have been, but it had also been more transformative and ultimately more rewarding. The young entrepreneurs in the audience were learning from my experience and building their own ventures on foundations of integrity and original thinking. The industry changes that had resulted from my case were helping protect other innovators from experiencing the kind of theft I had endured. My presentation focused on the practical steps entrepreneurs could take to protect their work, but it also emphasized the importance of persistence and authenticity in building sustainable businesses. I shared the lesson I had learned, that while betrayal and theft can cause tremendous pain in the short term, genuine innovation and ethical behavior ultimately triumph over deception and shortcuts. The questions from the audience revealed how much the startup community had learned about intellectual property protection in the years since my case had first gained attention. Entrepreneurs were more sophisticated about documentation and verification. Investors were more thorough in their due diligence processes. The entire ecosystem had become more aware of the importance of attribution and authentic collaboration. But the most meaningful moment came during the networking session after my presentation, when a young entrepreneur approached me with concerns about a potential theft of her own work. She had been developing an innovative educational technology concept and suspected that a former collaborator was planning to launch a competing business based on her research. Using the experience and expertise I had gained from my own case, I was able to help her understand her options and develop a strategy for protecting her work while pursuing her business goals. The conversation reminded me that the most important outcome of my experience wasn't the justice I had achieved for myself, but the knowledge and resources I could now provide to help others avoid similar betrayals. As I flew back to Austin that evening, I thought about Jake and Melissa and wondered what they were doing with their lives. The anger and desire for revenge that had motivated me for so many months had long since faded, replaced by a more complex understanding of how their actions had ultimately led to opportunities and achievements I never could have imagined. They had thought they were stealing my future, but instead, they had given me the motivation and skills to build something far more meaningful than my original vision. Their betrayal had been the catalyst for personal growth and professional success that exceeded anything I could have accomplished through the FitSync concept alone. The lesson I carried forward was that authenticity and persistence create advantages that no one can steal. Ideas can be appropriated, strategies can be copied, but the knowledge and relationships that come from genuine expertise and ethical behavior are uniquely valuable and inherently protected. Jake and Melissa had learned the opposite lesson, that shortcuts and deception might provide temporary advantages, but ultimately lead to unsustainable positions and professional destruction. Their theft had cost them far more than they had gained, while my pursuit of justice had created lasting value and meaningful impact. 5 years later, I was running a successful consulting practice that helped entrepreneurs and investors navigate the complexities of innovation and intellectual property. The fitness technology partnerships I had developed were generating meaningful revenue while creating products that genuinely helped people achieve their wellness goals. Most importantly, I had built a reputation based on authentic expertise and ethical behavior that no one could question or undermine. The betrayal that had once seemed like the end of my dreams had become the beginning of a career and life that was more fulfilling than anything I had originally planned. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from getting what we thought we wanted, but from discovering what we're truly capable of when faced with our greatest challenges. 7 years had passed since that devastating night, when I first discovered the photos of Melissa and Jake celebrating their stolen success at the TechCrunch Disrupt conference. As I sat in my corner office overlooking downtown Austin, reviewing applications for the Sarah Martinez Innovation Protection Fellowship I had established at the University of Texas, I marveled at how completely my life had transformed from those dark early days. The fellowship program had become one of the most prestigious opportunities for entrepreneurship students, providing funding and mentorship for young innovators while teaching them essential skills for protecting their intellectual property. Each year, I selected 12 students whose projects showed genuine innovation potential, and I spent months working with them to document their concepts, understand market dynamics, and build businesses on foundations of authentic research and original thinking. This year's applicant pool was particularly impressive. Among the submissions was a proposal from Maria Gonzalez, a computer science graduate student who had developed an innovative approach to mental health support through AI-powered peer counseling networks. Her research methodology and strategic thinking reminded me of my own early work, but with a sophistication and awareness of intellectual property protection that demonstrated how much the entrepreneurial education landscape had evolved. Another standout application came from David Chen, whose renewable energy storage concept addressed critical infrastructure challenges with solutions that were both technically innovative and commercially viable. David's documentation was meticulous, including patent research, competitive analysis, and detailed timelines that would make any attempt at idea theft immediately detectable and legally actionable. Reading through these applications, I felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond professional accomplishment. These young entrepreneurs were building on educational foundations and protective measures that had emerged partly from the lessons learned through my own experience with betrayal and theft. They would enter the business world better prepared and more aware of potential risks than I had been. The transformation of entrepreneurship education to include comprehensive intellectual property protection training had been one of the most significant systemic changes to emerge from the publicity surrounding my case. Universities across the country had implemented new curriculum requirements, and accelerator programs had made documentation and legal protection mandatory components of their training processes, but the changes extended far beyond educational institutions. The venture capital industry had fundamentally altered its due diligence processes in response to the patterns of deception that Rebecca Chen's investigation had revealed. Firms now employed specialized verification teams that included forensic analysts, intellectual property attorneys, and industry experts who could detect inconsistencies in founder narratives and business plan originality. Pinnacle Ventures had become a case study in investor responsibility and due diligence reform. After the scandal surrounding Melissa's misconduct and the firm's failure to detect obvious red flags in the FitSync investment, they had implemented some of the most rigorous verification procedures in the industry. Their new processes included independent verification of founder claims, detailed documentation requirements for business concept development, and mandatory cooling-off periods for investments recommended by employees with potential conflicts of interest. The changes at Pinnacle had been driven partly by legal consequences from their inadequate due diligence. Several investors in FitSync's funding round had pursued legal action against the firm, alleging that they had been misled about fundamental aspects of the investment opportunity. While the litigation had eventually been settled out of court, the financial and reputational costs had convinced the entire venture capital industry that enhanced verification procedures were essential for protecting both investors and legitimate entrepreneurs. Marcus Chen, the partner who had led Pinnacle's original investment in FitSync, had left the firm shortly after the scandal broke and had become an advocate for enhanced investor responsibility. He now ran educational programs for venture capital professionals, teaching about the warning signs of intellectual property theft and the importance of thorough founder verification. In a strange twist of irony, Marcus had reached out to me several years after the FitSync investigation to discuss potential collaboration on investor education initiatives. Our conversation had been awkward initially, given his role in enabling Melissa and Jake's deception, but his genuine commitment to preventing similar situations had led to a productive professional relationship. Marcus's transformation from enabler to advocate demonstrated how the consequences of my case had created positive changes even among people who had initially been part of the problem. His inside knowledge of venture capital decision-making processes, combined with hard-earned wisdom about the costs of inadequate due diligence, made him an effective educator for other investors. The broader technology industry had also evolved. In response to the intellectual property awareness that cases like mine had generated, major technology companies had implemented new policies for evaluating potential acquisitions and partnerships, including enhanced verification of the originality and ownership of core business concepts. Industry conferences had made intellectual property protection a standard topic, with sessions led by attorneys, entrepreneurs, and investors who had learned expensive lessons about the importance of proper attribution and documentation. Professional organizations had developed certification programs for entrepreneurs and consultants who specialized in intellectual property protection and innovation documentation. I had been among the first recipients of these certifications, and I now served on advisory boards that helped establish standards and best practices for the field. The consulting practice I had built around these emerging needs had grown beyond my original expectations. What had started as a way to help individual entrepreneurs protect their work had evolved into a comprehensive firm that worked with companies of all sizes, from early-stage startups to established corporations, seeking to enhance their innovation protection capabilities. My team now included former patent attorneys, technology transfer specialists, forensic analysts, and business strategists who had expertise in various aspects of intellectual property protection and verification. We worked with clients across multiple industries, helping them document their innovations, verify the originality of potential investments or partnerships, and develop cultures of authentic collaboration and appropriate attribution. The most rewarding aspect of the consulting work was seeing how proper intellectual property protection enabled rather than hindered innovation and collaboration. When entrepreneurs understood how to document and protect their work, they were more willing to share ideas and seek input from others. When investors knew how to verify the authenticity of business concepts, they could invest with confidence in genuinely innovative ventures. The wellness technology partnerships that had emerged from my original fitness app concept had also continued to evolve and expand. The collaborative approach I had developed with established wellness companies had proven more sustainable and impactful than the traditional startup model would have been. By focusing on my core expertise in user research and strategic thinking while partnering with organizations that had complementary capabilities, I had been able to see my innovations implemented at scale while maintaining appropriate attribution and financial benefits. The products that had emerged from these partnerships were now being used by millions of people worldwide, helping them achieve fitness and wellness goals through the psychologically informed approaches and community-centered features that had been central to my original vision. The impact on real people's lives had far exceeded what I could have achieved through FitSync alone, even if that venture had succeeded without the complications of theft and betrayal. More importantly, the collaborative model I had developed had become a template for other innovation partnerships. Universities, research institutions, and established companies were increasingly recognizing the value of working with independent researchers and strategic thinkers who could contribute specialized knowledge while allowing larger organizations to handle implementation and scaling challenges. This partnership approach had created new career paths for innovators who preferred research and strategic thinking to the operational demands of running traditional startups. Many of the entrepreneurs I worked with through my consulting practice and fellowship program were choosing collaborative models over independent startup launch, finding that partnerships allowed them to focus on their core interests while achieving greater impact. The personal transformation I had experienced was perhaps even more significant than the professional achievements. The process of seeking justice and building a new career had required me to develop capabilities and confidence I had never known I possessed. The frightened and angry person who had discovered the theft of her life's work had evolved into someone who could navigate complex professional relationships, influence industry practices, and create meaningful impact through authentic expertise. The emotional growth had been as important as the professional development. Learning to channel anger and hurt into productive action had taught me resilience and strategic thinking that served me well beyond the specific circumstances of my case. The experience of rebuilding from betrayal had shown me that setbacks and challenges could become sources of strength rather than just obstacles to overcome. The relationships I had built through my advocacy and consulting work had also created a professional network that was based on mutual respect and shared values rather than just transactional benefits. The entrepreneurs, investors, attorneys, and educators I worked with regularly had become genuine collaborators and friends who shared a commitment to ethical innovation and authentic achievement. One of the most meaningful relationships had developed with Chen, the journalist whose investigation had been crucial to exposing Melissa and Jake's deception. Rebecca had continued reporting on intellectual property issues and corporate accountability, becoming one of the most respected voices in technology journalism. Our collaboration on various articles and educational initiatives had created a friendship based on shared professional values and complementary expertise. Rebecca's continued investigation into startup fraud and investor accountability had revealed that my case was part of a much larger pattern of deception and misrepresentation in the technology industry. Her reporting had contributed to regulatory changes, legal precedents, and industry reforms that were protecting countless entrepreneurs and investors from experiencing similar betrayals. The long-term impact on Jake and Melissa's lives had followed predictable but sad trajectories. Jake had eventually found work at a smaller technology company in a mid-level position, but his career had never recovered from the reputational damage caused by the intellectual property scandal. His technical skills remained strong, but his credibility issues had prevented him from advancing to senior roles or leadership positions where integrity was essential. I occasionally encountered updates about Jake through mutual professional connections, and the picture that emerged was of someone who had learned hard lessons about the consequences of ethical shortcuts, but who was working to rebuild his reputation through consistent and honest professional behavior. While his career trajectory had been permanently altered by his actions, he seemed to have accepted responsibility for his choices, and was focusing on contributing meaningfully in his current role. Melissa's situation had been more dramatic and ultimately more transformative. After leaving the venture capital industry, she had spent several years struggling to find her professional footing in fields where her background and reputation created barriers rather than advantages. The experience of professional exile had apparently prompted significant personal reflection and growth. Remarkably, Melissa had eventually returned to school to pursue a master's degree in social work, focusing on supporting entrepreneurs and small business owners who were facing financial and emotional challenges. Her personal experience with professional failure and public accountability had given her unique insights into the psychological and practical challenges that entrepreneurs faced when their ventures failed or encountered serious difficulties. Through mutual professional connections, I had learned that Melissa was now working at a nonprofit organization that provided counseling and practical support to entrepreneurs whose businesses had failed or who were struggling with the emotional challenges of startup life. Her work focused particularly on helping founders who were dealing with guilt, shame, and identity issues related to professional setbacks. The irony of Melissa's career transformation was not lost on me. The person who had once stolen my work and betrayed my trust was now dedicating her professional life to helping other entrepreneurs recover from failures and setbacks. While I could never forget or fully forgive what she had done to me, I could recognize that her current work seemed to represent genuine effort to contribute positively to the entrepreneurial community. I had never resumed personal contact with either Jake or Melissa, and I had no intention of doing so. The relationships had been too deeply damaged by their betrayal for any kind of reconciliation to be possible or appropriate. But learning about their current situations had provided a sense of closure and confirmation that consequences had been proportional to actions, and that both of them had ultimately taken responsibility for their choices. The broader lesson from their trajectories was that while deception might provide temporary advantages, the long-term costs of unethical behavior far exceeded any short-term benefits. Both Jake and Melissa had achieved the success they thought they wanted through stealing my work, but that success had proven unsustainable because it was built on foundations of dishonesty rather than genuine capability and authentic achievement. In contrast, the slower and more difficult path I had taken to rebuild from their betrayal had created lasting advantages and meaningful impact that no one could question or undermine. The expertise I had developed, the relationships I had built, and the reputation I had earned were all based on authentic work and ethical behavior that would continue to create value throughout my career. As I finished reviewing the fellowship applications and prepared for the afternoon's mentoring sessions with current program participants, I reflected on how completely the narrative of my life had changed from that devastating night 7 years earlier. What had seemed like the end of my dreams had become the beginning of achievements and impact that exceeded anything I had originally imagined. The young entrepreneurs I worked with today were building their ventures in an ecosystem that was more supportive, more protective, and more ethical, partly because of the changes that had emerged from my experience with betrayal and theft. They would face their own challenges and setbacks, but they would do so with better preparation and stronger safeguards than had been available to me. The fitness technology concept that had been stolen from me had evolved into something far more meaningful through collaborative partnerships that honored attribution and shared benefits appropriately. The consulting practice and educational initiatives I had built were creating lasting impact that would continue long after my direct involvement ended. Most importantly, I had discovered capabilities and sources of satisfaction that I never would have explored if my original startup plans had succeeded as envisioned. The betrayal that had once seemed like the worst thing that could happen to me had ultimately led to the best outcomes I could have achieved. Sometimes the most devastating challenges become the foundations for the most meaningful successes. The key is finding the courage to transform anger into action, setbacks into strength, and betrayal into a commitment to building something better. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.